Ooh. Okay, hi. Good morning, or perhaps good afternoon, good evening to wherever people may be. And I just want to talk today about how I'm attempting to integrate a kind of principled approach to vocabulary instruction to support reading skills into my pedagogy. I'm doing this in response to research that exists in the field of second language acquisition, or SLA, going forward, pertaining to reading skills and vocabulary knowledge. And this is just an ongoing part of my evolving pedagogy, I would say. I'm not sharing answers or conclusions so much as I'm sharing where I am now and where I'm trying to go. And at the end, I'll share my email address if anybody wants to continue the discussion. So just regarding my context, I teach adult students who are, they may be undergraduate students at university, they may be graduate students, and they're also sometimes students just quote unquote studying English. I also have a lot of freedom in terms of making decisions about curriculum and materials, and I almost always use materials that I write myself. So I'm not really working with textbooks, so I don't have so much to say about that. And I frequently teach academic writing. And basically, I strongly believe in the role of input in facilitating language acquisition. So I place an emphasis on reading as part of that teaching writing. I use this word systematic in the presentation title, but when I say systematic, I mean it like according to a kind of plan and not definitive in any sense. This is part of my evolution, as I said, in my pedagogy, and I'm still working on this. So the way that I see it, this means a starting point being understanding the existing level of vocabulary knowledge of learners, and then evaluating potential text based on one principle, at least we can work with, is vocabulary frequency, and then adapting text to incorporate modified or elaborated input, and then finally just trying to do integrate review on a regular schedule. So whether it's teaching reading or teaching vocabulary in the context of reading, I think that these are closely related, okay? So in terms of understanding, I mean, a lot of research on reading comprehension skills places an emphasis on vocabulary knowledge as being a kind of essential ingredient or prerequisite to comprehension. I did a literature review on this subject last year, and it was really interesting. And it said, you know, if a learner knows 95% of the vocabulary in a text, they probably aren't really going to comprehend it. And yet 95% is a pretty high number to begin with. And so that, you know, if you look at the work of people like William Grabe or Paul Nation, they refer to other research that says, you know, a threshold for comprehension is more like 98%. People like Paul Nation or Stuart Webb, these are vocabulary research people, they really place an emphasis on having an understanding of your students' existing level of vocabulary knowledge as a step to doing any kind of planning of curriculum, syllabi, materials, whatever it is. It's a starting point. And if you don't know that information, it's maybe harder to know where your students are in terms of their existing English proficiency. I use the vocabulary size test. This is something that's I've been directed to from people like Paul Nation. This test attempts to give a measure of total receptive vocabulary size. So the knowledge of someone's vocabulary when they're doing a reading or a listening rather than speaking or writing, right? And you know, there's maybe no perfect way to measure someone's vocabulary knowledge. You know, words have so many aspects. You know, what does it mean to know a word? But you know, the VST, the vocabulary size test, is giving words students in frequency bands, essentially, and having them match for synonyms. And it's telling us something about vocabulary knowledge, okay? And it's also based on the principle that it makes sense to spend more time on words that are more frequent in the language rather than those that are less frequent, which is, you know, one reasonable way of understanding things. So I usually do this at the beginning of the semester. I ask students to do it, and they report their score to me, and it influences the kind of vocabulary I end up focusing on over the course of the semester and the materials that I use. And it also allows me to understand the self-reporting size of students at different levels over multiple semesters. So I start to understand what a typical student's vocabulary size might be at a given level, and what the outliers are. And kind of informally, I mean, I'm not doing research here, but what kind of correlations may exist between vocabulary size and other variables in language proficiency. And I'll just say that these slides contain some information about some of the things I'm talking about, and the slides are shared in the materials available for this conference. So I may not refer to everything on the slides, but if you're interested in checking this out, I would encourage you to do so. Okay, so as I said, frequency isn't the end all of understanding what words need to be learned, but it is a principled approach in the sense that it is one principle that might be understood as being a meaningful one. So as Paul Nation says, he says words should be frequently selected according to their relative value, and he's talking about frequency when he says relative value. Vocabulary can be classified as essential, high frequency, mid frequency, and low frequency, and words should generally be learned in order of classification, this classification. So what I do to facilitate that is I use Lexical Tutor. Lexical Tutor is a resource that's been around for a while, a web-based resource. It's an informal way of accessing corpus linguistic information from reliable resources like COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English, and the British National Corpus, the BNC. Those are the two big ones. So the information you get from those is reliable in the sense that it's coming from millions of words, millions of texts being analyzed and telling you which words are more frequent or less. So we were doing a unit or an essay writing task on the impact of the coronavirus on cities. And I happened to use the text from March in which an economist speculated on some of the impacts to New York. And I'm just showing it here to show you how I might go about working with LexTutor in regard to this approach. It says at some point, the risk from COVID-19 will recede but not disappear. What might America then be like? The largest cities in the country, and New York City in particular, will remain vital, but their futures will be clouded by serious health and economic issues. So when I put this into LexTutor, the first thing it tells me is it says 95% of the vocabulary is in the first 3,000 words, most commonly used words in English in the corpora. And that to get to 98%, you would need to have access to 6,000 words. Okay, so it shows you the words by color coding, and then this is how the text looks itself when you apply this. Oops. Wow, okay. When the text, hang on, sorry, a little tech problem. Okay, we'll just keep going. So what I do is I provide input enhancement, which is to say I start to do things like bolding, underlining, or italicizing words to promote conscious noticing of the target language. And sometimes I used elaborated input, which just means I'm adding my own bits of text to give additional definitions. And so rather than deny the learners the opportunity to see the original text, which is that rich linguistic input that learners need for acquiring the language, if I encounter something that's beyond their understood level of proficiency with the vocabulary, then I'm providing it an additional definition. So I'll show you how that looks. So typically with any text I give students, I have different kinds of ways of marking the language. I put words in bold, that's the target, what I understand is the target for their level of proficiency. I put words with this kind of gray background that are slightly above their target level proficiency based on that vocabulary size test. And I start to flag phrases and collocations, things that go together. And occasionally I'll put something in blue where I'll indicate that I've added it to the text. And so you can see, for example, the word norms is in their level of vocabulary knowledge from what I understand, but really this phrase, you know, it's just not norms alone in terms of its semantic meaning, but it's norms for something. And in this case, maybe it's strictest norms for something, and you might even include the article as part of the larger phrase. So in any case, I'm trying to, you know, facilitate noticing essentially of this vocabulary, okay? And you know, this text has two really low frequency words beyond the 10,000 range, which is 10,000 words is a high level of vocabulary knowledge for a second language user of English. But I left them in the text and I tried to add my own wording so they would understand. Okay, so the last thing I want to say is that, you know, you know, there's all this stuff about how many interactions to know word. Is there a number? I don't think there's a number according to existing research. I would just say it's one thing to research the vocabulary. It's one thing to know the student's vocabulary size. It's one thing to, you know, mark up the text like this, but you need to review. So there's so many ways to review vocabulary. I'm not listing them here, but I'm just saying I think it should be a principal part of the planning for making a focus on vocabulary knowledge, okay? So facilitating opportunities and teaching strategies for repeated encounters and interactions, okay? I have a whole bunch of references here that are worth checking out. If you're into the vocabulary stuff and you're not familiar, I would check out Paul Nation's work. And if you're interested in the role of modifying input in language acquisition, the work of Mike Long is well worth exploring. My email address is here, and I think I'm just about out of time. So whatever questions you may have, I'm happy to answer them or attempt to discuss them with you. And thank you for that.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Christopher Collins of Columbia University ALP. Now at this time, we have a little bit of time for Mr. Collins to address any of your questions. So please take a few moments, let this new information process, and please post your questions in the chat room at this time. Thank you. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. I know Annie Smith is on. Join me in the falls, please. Okay. Okay.
So maybe I can, oh.
Yep, we do. I'm going to post that up there. We have a question from Lisa Swovic. I'd like to see my students use newly acquired vocabulary in their writing. Do you require that they use the new vocabulary in their writing?
It's something that I do like to do. If we focus on developing an understanding of particular words related to the content of a text, for example, with the city essays, words were coming up like density, urban planning, etc. And so, yes, I think in a way it's a little, I'm not too explicit about requiring it, but I say, you know, here's 20 words being encountered in this unit, attempt to use 5 and put them in bold in your essay. So just to facilitate my noticing as well. So I think it's a good idea. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Mr. Collins. Let's go to Kristen Summers' question. Do you work on a theme of reading so that students see new vocabulary over again?
Yeah, I typically work on some kind of content theme over a few weeks, and there'll be multiple readings over the duration of that theme. So hopefully, in theory, if I've managed to plan it right, there should be multiple interactions in different places of the vocabulary. But again, I think so I think the answer is, hopeful answer is yes. The aspirational answer is yes. Whether it's always happening, probably not, but it depends. Okay, but I think that's a reasonable goal, yeah.
Okay, great question, Kristen. Let's go to Lindsay's question. Can you very quickly describe the vocabulary size test? Is that something young learners can use?
The truth is, I don't have enough experience with teaching young learners to say yes or no. I mean, think about it in turn. The format of the test is easy enough to use. I'll just tweak my video, forgive me. The format of the test is very simple. A relatively younger, if they're capable of reading, at a limited level? The answer is yes. But again, you'd encounter words because each question goes to a little bit of a less frequent word. So even if it would be a first language user of English, they would ultimately run into words that they don't know, that you don't know when you're like 10 years old, for example. So a mixed answer.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see, let's take one more question, and we're not going to be able to address all your questions, but I want to thank you all for some thoughtful questions. Very quickly to Rachel's question: what do you recommend for newcomers acquiring their knowledge, for newcomers and those acquiring their knowledge of vocabulary, Mr. Collins?
Is this? I just want to clarify. Is this a question about educators acquiring knowledge of vocabulary as part of the teaching, or is this about learners acquiring
That's a great
knowledge of vocabulary?
question. Rachel, for teachers.
Yeah, I personally, I would, that person, Paul Nation, is a seminal person in the field of vocabulary acquisition. And I would, you just look on, for example, YouTube, look up Paul Nation, and there's lectures that he tries to cover his work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he has books and so forth, but maybe YouTube would be a nice gateway to just hearing some of his basic ideas and what he perceives as key.
Okay.
Okay.
Appreciate that. Go ahead. I'm
Yep.
sorry. My apologies for interrupting. And at this time, Mr. Collins, thank you so much for some wonderful insight regarding the systematic approach to vocabulary instruction to support reading skills. To our participants, please stay on for our next presentation. As Mr. Collins indicated, he does have his email address. For those questions that were not addressed, please reach out to Mr. Collins, and I have no doubt he'll be happy to address them. So we're now going to transition away from Mr. Collins' presentation for our next presenter. So thank you again, Mr. Collins, for some wonderful insight.
Thanks, everybody, and hope there's something there for you. And thanks for the questions as well.
Thank you.
All right, I will go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen. Okay. So my presentation today will talk about using wikis for increasing students' exposure to vocabulary. And my name is Lauren Leshy. I teach ESL at the County College of Morris, a community college in New Jersey. And I did this wiki activity for students in my reading courses. I teach 2 different levels of reading. And this was to accompany or supplement a separate vocabulary textbook that we work with in the course. Okay, so why do we want to increase students' exposure to vocabulary? I think we know as language teachers that students need repeated exposure to vocabulary to really learn a new word. There's no consensus on how many exposures exactly will will force vocabulary learning. A study by Pellicer, Sanchez, and Schmidt suggests that at least 10 exposures can substantially increase outcomes like recalling the meaning of a word, recognizing a word. So while this isn't consistent throughout the research, we do have a ballpark here that it takes a lot of exposures to increase vocabulary knowledge and to learn a word. And as Stahl writes, with repeated exposures, some connections become strengthened as that information is found in repeated context and become the way the word is defined. And this is consistent with the feedback that I was getting from my students. As we were working through the vocabulary textbook, they were saying, well, this is great, but I really need more examples. Right? Can you give me more examples? And so to fill in this gap, I decided to create a wiki. So what is a wiki? A wiki is an online page that is open to all users for editing. So I think the most famous wiki that we know of is Wikipedia, of course. But in an educational context, it is a page that can allow students and instructors to collaboratively edit and maintain a page. So here's what I did. I used our learning management system, Blackboard, to create a wiki page for each chapter of our vocabulary textbook. And as we studied each chapter, I had students add sentences using the target vocabulary. And I told the students that these sentences could be student created, so they can make them themselves, or they can pull an example that they see in an authentic text, which really I prefer. But as they're reading, if they're reading for another class or even for our class, and they see an example of one of the words, they can pull it in and put it on the wiki. As students add sentences to the wiki, I monitor the page for usage, for grammatical accuracy, for clarity, and I will even upload some of the sentences that I create during our class discussions. So I want to show you what this looks like on Blackboard. So when you go into Blackboard, on the left side, you don't see it here, but if you go all the way down, you'll see a Wikis tab. And when you open up that Wikis tab, you'll see this main page here, and you'll have the option to create a wiki. And once you create a wiki, you'll see it here. And this was the wiki that I created for our vocabulary textbook. Now, if you're using Canvas or Moodle, the layout might look a little different, but hopefully you'll have more or less the same features. So once I created the wiki page, I uploaded the instructions, and then for each chapter in our vocabulary book, I would create a separate page. So I would click this Create Wiki Page button, and then as I created the pages, I would see them on the right side. So before the class started, before the semester, I would preload all of the vocabulary and the part of speech onto a wiki page for each chapter. And then as we worked through each chapter, I would ask students to go in and click this Edit Wiki Content, which will bring up a text box, and they can add their sentences. So after they work with it, it looks something like this, right? So we see the word, we see a number of sentences here with the word. I ask them to either bold or underline the word, part of noticing so that they can see where the word is used. And we have a nice collection of sentences that look like this. So a couple tips as you complete this in class. The biggest tip that I would give is the technical side. Make sure that you know your learning management system in your wiki settings. So a couple things to think about. The first one, does the platform allow for simultaneous editing? On Blackboard, only one user can edit the wiki at a time. Maybe in other platforms, probably like Google, it would allow for simultaneous editing. So this is really important to know, especially if this is something you want to do in class. I have students do this outside of class, but this could be a fun activity in class as well. Another thing to think about is if the version history is available. It hasn't happened yet, but it is possible that on accident a student could delete part or all of a wiki page. And it might be good to make sure that you can go back and restore an older version of the wiki should something crazy happen. And the last question, or the last consideration, is can you find a participant summary for the wiki? So if I go back here, I can see that on the right side, I have a participation summary. And this tells me who is adding and updating the wiki, how many words they're adding to the wiki, what percentage of the wiki they are altering or changing. And this allows me to see who's participating, so I can know if there's a student that's not adding to the wiki. Another suggestion that I would give is to create an instructional video. So I've had a few students over the past few semesters when I've done this have a really hard time remembering how to go in and add sentences to the wiki. So I used a screen recording software to create a demo video, and that was really helpful for the students that maybe aren't as tech savvy. I recommend that you monitor the wiki frequently to ensure quality, to ensure clarity of the sentence, accuracy. I find that the biggest edits that I have to make are for clarity. They might give me a very short, vague sentence using the target vocabulary. So I might go in and put in a little bit more context to that sentence or ask the student to do that. I also recommend that you add a few sentences of your own. This adds to the collaborative nature of the wiki when really everybody in the course, both the student and instructor, are working together to compile these sentences and create this resource. So a couple of variations. Of course, you can use a different learning platform. You could use Canvas, Moodle, Google Classroom. There are a few wiki pages that are not built into any learning management system, so they're just websites on their own where you can create a wiki as well. You could have the students write their sentences in class. This could be a good bell ringer activity or exit ticket. And you'd be able to screen the sentences before they add them to the wiki. So if you're concerned about the students maybe adding sentences that have a lot of grammatical issues or aren't using the words correctly, this gives you a way to pre-screen those questions or those sentences. You could have students write a paragraph using multiple target vocabulary and post their paragraph instead of organizing the wiki by individual words. And maybe for older learners or more advanced learners, you could have students require them to use exclusively authentic examples of the target vocabulary that I call out in the wild, right? They're finding these samples in authentic sources. It could be a corpus, for example, for more advanced learners. Some of the benefits of this, it increases their exposure to new vocabulary, right? It provides them those examples that they're telling me that they really need. And they can use this as they're studying for their vocabulary quizzes and their assessments later on. And they can go back and look at it, you know, later on in the course. I think they do have access to it after the course ends as well. I find that it increases students' motivation because it is collaborative. And when students know that what they're creating is going to be put on display for the whole class, it does seem to increase their motivation, and they really do put more effort into making quality work, creating quality work when they know that it's going to be shared with everybody. And students have been giving me really good feedback about this activity. They write on their evaluations that this is really helpful. They ask me, can we keep doing this because this is providing a benefit for me. This is really helping me in my vocabulary learning. Okay. So here are the resources or references that I used. And I do want to leave some time for questions. I have my email address also here, both my personal and my professional email address. So if I don't get to any of your questions at this moment, please feel free to email me later on. I'm happy to take any questions right now.
Terrific. Thank you, Lauren. We do have a few questions in the chat. We'll start with Nicole Bell's question. Can you see which students has added which sentences?
That's a great question.
Okay.
In Blackboard, my participant summary does not include the sentence that the student adds. It tells me how many words the student has added to the wiki and what percentage of the wiki has been changed or submitted by each student. So this is, you know, where it's important to know for your particular learning management system to know what the settings are. If you do want students to be able, if you want to see which sentences the students add, you would either have to have them like write their name after their sentence, or if your system allows you to see exactly what every student's posting, then you don't have to do that. So it just depends on the settings for each learning management system.
So, Kristen Summers asks, how tolerant are you of errors in use? For example, e.g. Register.
That's a good question. I will go in and I will correct sentences. You know, I see a lot of article usage, right? So, you know, some of the small stuff, I'll go in and fix it myself. And I think the students like that. They ask me, you know, are you going to look at my sentences and make sure that everything looks good? So, you know, they want me to take a look, and I want to take a look as well. If the word is not used correctly, then that's something that I would either go in and kind of rework the sentence, or if I know who posted it, then I would, you know, talk with them and say, hey, let's try to fix that sentence and make sure that the usage is correct. For me, the most important thing is that they're using the word correctly. If there's preposition or article errors, I'll fix them, but it's not anything that I'm overly concerned about.
Okay. And Kristen Summer has added, sometimes it's not natural usage.
Yeah, so depending on how unnatural it sounds, I might go in and make a few adjustments. What I find the most is students we'll try to use the word, but the sentence is very minimal, and you can't really get a sense of the meaning of the word based on the sentence that they provided. So then I would maybe go in and add a little bit more to the sentence so that it's clear what that word means from that sentence.
Thank you. Any final questions or thoughts from our participants? Yes, of course. Thank you for that insight, Lauren Leshy from County College of Morris, New Jersey. Any final thoughts? Okay, fantastic. Lauren Leshy, thank you so much for some wonderful insight as well using Wikis. We're totally going to use that for our Puerto Rican Hispanic Youth Leadership Institute. So thank you so much. Appreciate that. And our final presenter today, Brittany Ober from Columbia College ALP, or American Language Program, is up next, our final presenter in during this hour.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the presentation today. My name is Brittany Ober, and I'm a lecturer in language at the American Language Program at Columbia University. And I'm changing the theme a little bit here because today I'm going to talk to you not about vocabulary, but about Zoom interviews as listening materials. And so let me just quickly give you some context about the ALP. We teach an integrated skills English intensive program, and we have levels 2 through 9. That correlates to CEFR levels A1 to C1. And in this program, we have students coming to us from all over the world. They speak a variety of first languages, and they come to us with different reasons for studying, some for academic, some for professional, and some for personal enrichment. And so I'm going to be talking to you today about lessons for these students in particular, but I really believe that Zoom interviews can be used with any group of learners, and hopefully you'll see that when I present it to you. Oops. And so let's talk about what Zoom interviews actually are and how I came to think of them. The first thing is that guest speakers are a regular part of our program. We typically like to invite at least one guest speaker into the physical classroom. We usually teach in week-long or 2-week-long content-based thematic units. And so it's always nice to have an expert on one of those themes come into the classroom to have a discussion with the students. But as many of you experienced in March 2020, we were pivoting to a remote context pretty quickly, and we had to come up with a new perspective on what guest speaker actually meant. I took this to be a new opportunity for creating materials. And what I decided to do was to use Zoom to record conversations with an expert on a theme instead of having them come into the live classroom, because that could be used for listening practice with materials that I created. And so let me show you what that would be like, or why I like them. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how I believe Zoom interviews can mix intensive and extensive listening principles. In the first column here, you'll see the typical features of intensive listening. Intensive listening is usually done in class. It's usually teacher selected text, and so that would maybe include the textbook that you use in your course, or it might include any audio or video that you get from the internet from different sources. These texts that we focus on in class tend to be shorter. A typical textbook text for listening is about 2 to 5 minutes, and it makes sense because we don't have enough time to spend listening in the classroom. We have a lot of other things to do. The teacher usually manages the sequence of tasks, and those tasks usually are main ideas, details, inferences, sometimes other things, but we also want to develop our students' listening skills. And so with extensive listening, which is one of my favorite areas of research, I believe that this can really act as a useful complement to intensive listening. Because of its nature of being a more relaxed practice. So extensive listening is the second column. It's usually done out of class. It's student selected text, so they can choose anything that they want, including TV shows, films, music, TED Talks, YouTube videos, anything that they want, just as long as those texts are longer. So for me in my classroom, I say that that has to be at least 15 minutes. And then the sequence of tasks is co-managed because the teacher can suggest a certain order for the students to go through the exercises, but they can ultimately decide what works best for them at home. Extensive listening tends to focus on main ideas, but also personal reactions, reflection, and metacognition, which is very important. And it can focus on cultural issues, grammar, pronunciation, or content if the teacher makes that part of the listening exercise. And so again, Zoom interviews, I think are a useful way of combining these two types of listening. And I'm going to show you that next. So let's say you wanted to try this. This is the process that I would suggest. The first thing that you need to do, obviously, is choose someone to interview. Usually when I get my syllabus ready for the course, I start to run through my contacts in my mind and think about who connects with a certain theme, and then I will invite them to the class. If they accept, the first thing I would do is write the questions that I would want to ask that person, and I do send these questions to the person in advance of the actual meeting set up in Zoom. This will help you to keep the interview flowing pretty I don't know, organically, and then you don't have to do a lot of editing to the video, which will save you time. And it will also give that person an idea of what you want to have them talk about so they can prepare a little bit. When you write those questions, you can integrate different grammar and vocabulary that you know will be taught during the week that interview will take place in the classroom. And so it's very helpful to do that as well. The next step is to set up the meeting to interview on Zoom, make sure that you're recording the interview to the cloud, and then unfortunately you have to watch the interview, which is a little bit uncomfortable if you don't like to watch yourself on video. But you have to do it a few times, and you can also make use of the captions in Zoom. Even though they are not completely accurate, there are some funky things that will happen with those. They can help you to give a sense of what occurred in that text that you recorded. Once you've watched the interview a few times, you can begin to write the materials for the listening lesson. And you can consider different activities in those materials. Some things to consider include making predictions, main ideas, details, inferences, discourse analysis, synthesis with other listenings or readings, summarizing the content, and then some grammar and vocabulary items and discussion, and the list goes on and on. You could have students investigate something discussed in the interview and then give a presentation, and you can really be creative and customize this to your group as much as possible. So this is the process, and let me give you two examples. The first example is from a level 3 class at the ALP. That correlates to CEFR level B1. And in this course, the students were studying sports and games. In the week that this interview was shown to the students, they were studying women in sports. And so I interviewed my sister, Caitlin, because she is a former college basketball player. The interview was 23 minutes. And before the students went home to listen to the interview, in the class we previewed just 1 minute of Caitlin introducing herself, and then the students made some predictions about what she would discuss in the interview. For homework before the next class, the students listened to the whole interview, and this is extensive listening. They had a worksheet with every single question that I asked in the order that I asked them, and they had to write down anything that they could hear. So remember, this is a B1 class. I'm not expecting them to be able to write everything, but maybe just a few words, maybe a few phrases. And then they would make a plan for what they wanted to do for the next time they listened. And they went back and listened again and added some more information to each question. They brought that to the next class and they compared it with a partner. And then after that, we did some more intensive listening in the classroom. So we had detailed questions, true and false, where they corrected the false statements to make them true. We did some inferences with vocabulary from context. And then the students had a discussion about the content of the interview. The last step that I added to this lesson was grammar. So we were learning phrasal verbs in the course, and somehow magically Caitlin used a lot of phrasal verbs in her interview. I think it was like 12 or 14. And so I isolated all of them and created a worksheet. First, we went over the form, meaning, and use of phrasal verbs, and then we matched the vocabulary of those phrasal verbs to what they actually meant that Caitlin used. The students then created their own sentences and then used phrasal verbs in speaking. And so this was a really nice sequence for them to go through, and they had a lot of fun doing it. The second example is from a higher level class, so it's ALP level 8, which is CEFR level C.1, or C1, sorry, not .1. And it was with my friend Kelly, who is an essayist and a ghostwriter, who published an essay called A Year in New York. The course that the students were in was about New York City, and the project at the end of the course was to write a personal essay about their experience in either New York or any city in the world. This interview was 18 minutes about, and before the students actually watched the interview, they had read Kelly's essay, A Year in New York, and they had gone through a reading comprehension lesson. They were able to make predictions based on the reading for what she would talk about in the interview. And when they went home to do the extensive listening portion, they worked on some main ideas and detailed questions. They also did some short writing exercises because in the interview, Kelly suggested ways to brainstorm and become inspired about your own life as a writer. One of those exercises was to sit down and draw a map of the place where you grew up. And so the students did, I think, 2 mini brainstorming writing exercises to practice getting inspired for their final project essay. Then in the next class, the students went over that information that they filled in, and they also reviewed the grammar for writing questions and how to write a provocative question. Because in the next class, Kelly came to the Zoom room to do a live Q&A with the students. And so this was like a 3-day sequence of lessons, and it was really awesome for the students to get into a nice discussion with the writer that they had read and then the speaker that they had listened to. And so just to review the intensive and extensive listening principles that I think were combined by these lessons. On this list here, the orange items, I believe, were accomplished by both of these lessons. The blue items, it depends on what you're doing. So if you are isolating some excerpts of these interviews in your class, you can get to that shorter text intensive listening principle. If you're having some of this done in class, the teacher is managing the sequence of tasks. But if you're having students do some of it at home, they're managing it at home. The only thing that wasn't really met or accomplished here was that the students would select the text, and unfortunately it's kind of impossible because if you're creating an interview, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and you're not going to be able to let the students pick. But I think that because we've met all the other things in this lesson, that's worth the loss. And just some general benefits of Zoom interviews. I just want to repeat these things so you can connect them to the course content. It allows you to invite new voices into your classroom, and students get used to your voice, so this is really important, I think. You can really write the interview questions with recently practiced vocabulary and grammatical structures, and as Christopher and Lauren said in their presentations, that hearing the vocabulary again is really, really important for students, and it gives them that extra encounter. You can also ensure the repetition of language, either vocabulary or grammar, in the listening text itself, because if the person you're interviewing says something that you think that needs to be clarified for your students or that needs to be repeated, you as the interviewer can do that in the text in a semi-authentic way. You can write your pre, while, and post-listening items customized to match the needs of your class. And again, you can facilitate the blended practice of intensive and extensive listening. And the best part is you can record this interview and archive it for future use. And I'm just wrapping up here to show you that there's a bibliography available. This is all about extensive listening mostly, so please feel free to investigate it. My slides are in the folder. And if you have any questions, you can contact me at my email address. So I'm not sure if we have time for anything now, but Tanya, I'll let you decide.
Terrific. Brittany Ober from Columbia University ALP. Thank you so much. And once again, we're going to leave the slide up here for her email contact so you can send your questions to her. I know she'll be able to answer them. And I just want to thank you again. And I want to very quickly, I'm going to share a slide and bear with me. And bear with me. Thank you. Hold on just a moment. Oh, there it is. Okay, so very quickly, I want to once again thank Christopher Collins and Brittany Ober from Columbia University ALP and Lauren Leshy from County College of Morris, New Jersey. Thank you so much for some wonderful insight and learning for all the participants. To our participants, I just want to remind you to please, the only way we improve the professional learning experience for you in the field is because of your feedback. Please take a moment and fill out the feedback form. Please give us your honest feedback. And we also encourage all participants, including our presenters, to also share on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. I only shoot myself from the right side. To encourage you all to tell us what you learned. What one takeaway did you learn or take away from you from today's session today? And then finally, just a reminder about next year's conference, which is happening November 4th, 5th, and 6th in 2021. All right, once again, thank you for all of you for participating. And just a reminder, we have some really great sessions coming up at 11 o'clock with Diane Larson-Freeman. We also have some really great afternoon sessions as well. Don't forget, Dr. Ophelia Garcia will be at 11:45 to talk about translanguaging. And once again, I want to thank you all for your participation, and to our presenters, thank you again. And Tanya Rosado Berenger signing off from Central New York. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon. So I don't know what, wait, hold on. End this meeting so they can't linger. Okay. Thanks again.